It's Friday morning here in Västerås, Sweden, and all week I've had it in mind to sit down and film some words for you. But I've been waiting, I guess, and wondering where to start from. And then when I got to my desk this morning, there was an email from another Vanessa, one of the scholars and friends who were part of the first public course that we held last summer at a school called Home. And in that mail were a couple of lines from the poet T.S. Eliot from East Coker, which feel exactly like the place to be beginning this morning. I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. You've asked me to talk about hope and to offer a provocation, perhaps, a caution against hope. And this is stuff that I've been working with for a long time, since at least as far back as when Paul Kingsnorth and I wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto 10 years ago. Talking about it now, on the one hand, I have a sense quite viscerally of climate change coming home to people and places that I know well in ways that still catch me by surprise and shock me, even with years of having sat with this stuff. And also a sense that over recent months, it feels like something is shifting in the conversations that I catch the edges of around climate. Both the conversations that take place quietly within and around institutions, and also the larger public conversation. And that's partly the sense that things are moving very fast, that it gets harder for people to talk about climate change as if it's something that is hanging out there in the future that might be prevented or warded off. And I have a sense that what's happening is that the dominant story about climate change as something that can be potentially managed or solved, something that can be treated as an obstacle we might hope to get around and continue on a pre-existing path of development, progress, growth, or whichever language is used for that. That story is coming under strain from multiple directions to a point where it feels like it could easily rupture quite soon. A couple of examples, straws in the wind, that contribute to that sense that there might be a rupture coming. One of them is a paper published last summer by Jem Bendell, who's Professor of Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cumbria. And I got to know Jem fairly well. And when I first met him, he seemed to me very much like a kind of big NGO sustainability guy. He was consulting to the UN. He'd been involved in setting up the Marine Stewardship Council. He didn't seem like someone who was kind of wrestling with the existential implications of climate change. He was pretty busy. But then a couple of years ago, he got back in touch with me. And I remember him saying, I think that I've arrived at a similar place to where you and Paul were when you wrote the manifesto. And he was trying to work out, from a position of a different kind of experience and authority to anything that I have, how to frame, how to talk about the possibility that it's it's too late to make our current way of living sustainable, that what's at stake now is how bad things get, how much can be salvaged, how to what extent it's possible to slow and soften the crash rather than continue some pre-existing trajectory. And he came up with this framework, which he calls deep adaptation. It started out with a keynote that he gave at a conference in Australia. And then last summer, he published a paper called Deep Adaptation, a Map for Navigating Climate Tragedy. And this has a strange story to it because it was submitted to a journal which he's on the board of, and the peer reviewers asked for some very substantial changes, which, as far as Jem was concerned, were really taking out the argument that he was trying to make in the paper and turning it into something different. And so he withdrew it and instead published this as an occasional paper from the institute that he's head of in Cumbria. And over the rest of the year, so by December, it had been downloaded 100,000 times. And I've had conversations with foreign correspondents, with solar punk hackers, with accelerationists who are talking about that paper and the way that it's changed the conversations going on in their networks and communities. So something else that I've talked about and written about a bit is Extinction Rebellion, which is a new movement that grew up very quickly over the autumn, starting in the UK and spreading now internationally. And there are various striking things about it, partly the framing of what's at stake with climate change in terms of extinction, the ongoing mass extinction that we're already in the middle of, and the serious prospect of human extinction. And that's not how the climate activism that I've witnessed and been involved in has tended to be framed in the past. And there are a couple of things that strike me with Extinction Rebellion. One is the room for a breadth of different emotions within it. It brings me back to something that Paul and I were talking about when we started Dark Mountain, which was a sense that our experience had been of movements which policed emotions fairly tightly. That there were kind of two stances that were very welcome. One was anger and indignation, and the other was a stance of optimism and a kind of can-do rhetoric. People we knew who were prominent figures within the environmental movement were standing up and giving essentially the same speech they'd been giving 5 years earlier, saying, we've still got time, one more push, one more mobilization around a COP meeting, we can do this. And if you caught the same person quietly over a drink at the end of the evening, then they were pessimistic to the point of despair. And it felt to me as though what we were witnessing, what we were part of, was a church where the priests had lost their faith but didn't think that the ordinary people in the pews were ready to hear the bad news. And that seemed dangerous. Part of what we've done over the years with Dark Mountain, both through the writing and publishing, but also through the events and gatherings that we hosted, was to create a space where people could bring the stuff that wasn't necessarily welcome in the movements they've been part of, to bring your fears and your doubts and despair, and not be told to keep it to yourself, not be told, oh, you're burnt out. One way that I've talked about it is to say, I think for a lot of people, Dark Mountain has been a journey to the far side of despair. And my sense is if this kind of reading, and there are other elements to it, if this reading of the signs of the times is in any way right, if there is some kind of rupture gathering around the story of climate as something manageable, solvable, then a much larger contingent of people are starting to cross that threshold, looking for ways to have those kinds of conversations. And I guess in the context of the work that you guys do, particularly as teachers, there's a question that arises here, which is, isn't there a responsibility to give hope, especially to young people, especially given the mental health crisis amongst young people that we're seeing, in all kinds of countries. There was a very striking statistic this week reported in Britain. The number of young people aged 16 to 25 who say that life is not worth living has doubled in a decade to 18%. My suggestion would be that the best thing that we can be doing is not providing messages of hope so much as creating spaces to which people can bring fears and doubts and despair without being judged or critiqued, and without a rush to action or to answers. There's a passage from the theatre maker Chris Good from a book called The Forest and the Field, Changing Theatre in a Changing World, which I've found a lot of help from over recent years, which captures some of this. He says, "My sense is that only seldom is the problem that we don't know, or at any rate that we don't know enough. The real problem is that we don't have a living space in which to fully know what we know, in which to confront that knowledge and respond to it emotionally, without immediately becoming entrenched in a position of fear, denial, and hopelessness." That sense that what we need is not more facts or stories or calls to action exactly, but spaces where it's possible to go from sitting in isolation with what you suspect or fear about the world, about where things are headed, to actually admitting those things to each other. There is a quickening, a coming alive that happens in those spaces that I've seen again and again. So that's one of the things that I do have some confidence in. And when it comes to that warning about hoping for the wrong thing, I think that often the way that we've framed what needs to be done about the mess the world is in offers less hope than it thinks it does. And here I'm thinking particularly about sustainability as a concept. It was brought into focus for me this month by something that showed up in my Facebook feed. It was actually a kind of clickbait advert for an organisation called 8 Billion Trees, who want to fix climate change by planting billions of trees. And it's a bit of an oversimple proposition. But what struck me was when you click through from the advert, there was this whole long dystopian description of where we're headed. And then their kind of call to action says, but if we plant more trees, then all of that dystopian nightmare goes away and everything continues as usual. That was their promise. That was their vision of hope. And I thought, yeah, everything continues as usual. 1 in 5 of our young people not thinking life is worth living. It's like sustainability has often come to mean the project of sustaining our current way of living at any cost. When we come along and say we need to engage in the biggest collective enterprise in the history of humanity in order to make our way of living sustainable. We need to put all of this effort into ensuring that all of this can stay as much as possible like it is now. I'm not sure that the appeal of that has been quite as large as people have sometimes assumed. It seems to me at this point that it might be more helpful to think of what's at stake in terms of negotiating the surrender of our way of living rather than making our way of living sustainable. Attempting to demobilize as much as we can of the activity that goes on within our societies that is contributing to the trajectories that we're on. As I say it, I hear the impossibility of what we're talking about. But part of the difficulty, part of the fix that we're in is that impossible things are going to happen, because what is thinkable, what is supposed to be possible, the continuation of this way of living, is the one thing we know, however short or long the trajectory to it all going to hell is. That's the trajectory that spells. So one way or another, things that are meant to be impossible are going to happen in the times to come. The idea of negotiating a surrender, the idea of giving up, being humbled, perhaps humiliated, but living to tell the tale, that for me is not just wishful thinking, and it's not being stuck in what Chris Good is describing, the sort of the position of paralysis, the despair that you can't get out of either. And I don't think, I'm not pretending that I know what that means. I don't think any of us do fully, except that it is going to involve those kinds of conversations, admitting things to each other. Another analogy besides the negotiating a surrender one might be what we're looking for is a kind of Alcoholics Anonymous for a whole culture, collectively admitting to each other the things that we secretly fear in the dark moments in the middle of the night about where we're at, how we got here, all the stuff that was left out of the stories by which we constructed those trajectories of development and progress and growth. And in that, not having any pretense that there's a guarantee. Another thing that I think is mistaken in the ways that we've thought and talked about hope is that we felt like we need to give people a promise, that there needs to be a kind of bargain with the universe on offer. If you do this list of 10 things that's at the end of the talk by the climate change speaker, if we do this list of 10 things, then all of the nightmares that have been conjured up earlier in the talk will go away. I think we have to work now from the acknowledgement that it may be too late, that it may be, not only may it be completely impossible for us to have some kind of non-linear cultural and social and political shift, which is what surrendering our way of living would imply. It may be that even if we do that, things are already out of control. One thing that I found really striking with Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, who's one of the founders of that movement and who's a social movement scholar, gives a talk where at the end he says, this idea that activism needs to be motivated by outcomes, that we need to have a story of progress that we're placing ourselves in, that we need to convince ourselves that the arc of history is bending in the direction we would like it to go, and that our action is going to contribute to that. This is actually historically peculiar. In most times and places, people have been motivated to act for change by a sense of doing the right thing rather than by a promise of what will happen as a result of doing it. And that there's a greater resilience in that. And I'm utterly convinced from my experience that that is true. That if people change their behaviour because there is a promise, explicit or implicit, that as a result of this, things will be okay, then somewhere down the line they hit the point where the doubts bubble up and they go, I don't believe that this is going to make a difference. And it's very hard to keep going at that point if your reason for doing whatever you're doing is structured around that kind of bargaining with the universe. So any kind of hope worth having, the hope that lies on the far side of despair, I'd say has to be a hope with no guarantees. The only thing that we can know for sure is that we're all going to die. Not necessarily in some grand Hollywood apocalypse, to the extent that there is a catastrophe. It's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. But we were all always already going to die. That's part of what it means to be human. And if our culture, the culture that has got us into this mess, has struggled to face the realities of where we find ourselves, to know what we know, in Chris Good's terms, then I think part of that is because this culture has been peculiarly bad at facing the human scale reality of extinction that's waiting for each of us somewhere down the line. And actually, in terms of creating these spaces where people can talk about the things that they're sitting privately with, part of what that's about is actually spaces where we can come to terms with our own mortality, not because we should all stop trying to change things, stop fighting pipelines, stop being involved in the struggle to set things on a less bad course than it looks like they're on. But because if we haven't made room for, if we haven't dealt with, if we haven't come to know the reality of our own deaths that are waiting for us sooner or later down the line, then a lot of energy is bound up in avoiding that. A lot of energy is bound up in it, and there's a risk that we are not able to see clearly what's at stake, what we're talking about when we're talking about the mess that the world is in, because we're projecting our fear of our own mortality onto that. So I wanted to end with one passage that is kind of really important to me, one of those things that I can come back to and hold on to. It comes from John Berger, who's known as an art critic, novelist, essayist, Marxist, and I want to add to that list grassroots postmodernist. It's a term that comes from Gustavo Esteva and Madhu Suryaprakash from a book that they published in the 90s, where they talk about how there is another postmodernism going on that comes from below, from those who are on the hard end of modernization projects in countries like Mexico and India, where they come from. And my way of telling it would be to say that what we are usually talking about when we talk about postmodernism is a movement that was born out of the failure of the hopes of 1968 and out of the retreat to the university from the streets. For me, Berger embodies, along with people like Prakash and Esteva, another retreat, a retreat to the mountains, a retreat to peasant and indigenous cultures, a bringing into dialogue of the things that can be salvaged from the hopes of modernity with the things that were in its shadow. Berger settled in the Haute-Savoie in the French Alps, in one of the last pockets of peasant culture in Western Europe in the early 1970s, and rethought a lot of his earlier work in the context of the culture that he spent his life within there. And there's an essay from the early 80s where he goes to the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, and he's been asked to speak about hope. And he says to them, suppose we say that we're not living in a world in which it is possible to construct something approaching heaven on earth, but on the contrary, are living in a world whose nature is far closer to that of hell. What difference would this make to any single one of our political or moral choices? We would be obliged to accept the same obligations and participate in the same struggle as we are already engaged in. Perhaps even our sense of solidarity with the exploited and suffering would be more single-minded. All that would have changed would be the enormity of our hopes, and finally, the bitterness of our disappointments. And in this essay, he's writing about Leopardi, a deeply pessimistic thinker, you might say. But he arrives at this wonderful passage right at the end, which is one of those things that I find I can hold on to. The production of reality has never been finished. Its outcome has never been made decisive. Something is always in the balance. Reality is always in need, even of us, damned and marginal as we may be. We're all going to die. We were all going to die anyway, but we're not dead yet. And without pretending that we know how the story ends, or when the story ends, or that there is even a story that can end, without pretending that we can fix it all, without pretending that everything's going to be okay, there's lots of stuff that we can do in the meantime. And I think that learning how to frame that kind of invitation, learning how to hold that kind of space and bring all of the knowledge, the facts, the things that we know about, the things that we need to do in relation to the mess that we're in, into a space that's held like that might be the best chance we have of things turning out less badly than most of us probably secretly fear they're likely to turn out. So that's what I've got for you for today. Thank you.